I've been on a few boards, and I do have to say this is the most active board, and I won't say I look forward to going to every meeting, but I'm always glad, once I've been there, I'm always glad that I went. I feel very good about the relationships that I've made and nurtured through New Pioneers. And I guess I owe that to our next speaker, Sister Claire McGowan, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker. Is that what you? Yeah.
That's what I am.
That's right. That's right. Everybody knows Claire. She is the founder of this group, and she is our executive director. And I'm proud and pleased to know her and call her a friend. Sister Claire.
Thank you, Mary. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for being here tonight. There could be no greater pleasure for me this evening than introducing our guest speaker, Mary Berry. I first met Mary about 3 years ago at a social event, and I was struck immediately by her personal warmth, her sense of humor, and her realness. As the conversation progressed, I quickly realized that she's also smart as a whip and deeply passionate about her life's work. Mary is a graduate of the University of Kentucky. She farmed for 30 years as she and her husband raised their 3 children and did all the catering for the private and public events they had at their winery. 3 years ago, Mary established the Berry Center in New Castle, Kentucky, to preserve the work of her father, Wendell, her uncle, John Berry Jr., and her grandfather, John Berry Sr. And she founded the Berry Center in New Castle to serve as a repository for the study of small farm agriculture in our state. 2 years ago, the Berry Center began collaborating with St. Catherine College to establish a 4-year degree in farming and agroecology. Some of the very first students in that innovative and exciting program are with us tonight. So would you all stand up, please? These are real pioneers in another sense. So thank you for being with us tonight. And your teacher, Dr. Leah Bayens, who's on our board. Mary is invited to speak all over this nation and in many other parts of the world. And she speaks about land use and farm policy and farmer education, urban education about farming, and local food infrastructures. We are so honored and blessed, Mary, that you chose to make the time to be here tonight to share with us. So please join with me in welcoming Mary Berry, farmer, writer, leader, and wise woman. Thank you.
You know, after that introduction, I think it's best that I just sit back down. So I'm going to disprove all the things that you said. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. I love this area of Kentucky. I don't know that I had been to Washington County until a couple of years ago when I was looking for a place to bring or to start the Berry Center farming program. I visited colleges all over Kentucky and some outside of Kentucky. And when I came to St. Catherine, it just seemed like the right place to be, partly because it was so and is so exquisitely beautiful. Also because at the meeting, the first meeting, I believe, with President Houston and a couple of the deans of the college, I was asked how our work fit with the work of the Dominican nuns. And I thought that was exactly the right question. And really, that question, because of that question, I decided that we would bring our program here. So I am a great appreciator of the Dominican nuns, and I'm glad to be here on Dominican Nun Appreciation Day. I think that was beautifully put, don't you all? To talk about the Berry Center, it is necessary to recall the winter of 1907 at what we have always called the home place in Henry County, Kentucky. My grandfather, then 6 years old, sat with his older brother and listened as their parents spoke of the uses they would have for the money from their 1906 tobacco crop. The crop was to be sold at auction in Louisville on the next day. They would have been sitting in the light of a kerosene lamp close to the stove, warming themselves before bedtime. They were not wealthy people. The debt on their farm was not fully paid. There would have been interest to pay. There would have been other debts. The depression of the 1890s would have left them burdened. Perhaps after the income from the crop had paid their obligations, there would be some money that they could spend as they chose. At about 2 o'clock the next morning, my grandfather was wakened by a horse's shod hooves on the stones of the driveway. His father was leaving to see the crop sold. He came home that evening, as my grandfather later said, without a dime. After the crop had paid its commission on its sale, there was nothing left. Thus began my grandfather's lifelong advocacy, later my father's and uncle's, and now my brother's and mine, for small farmers and for land-conserving communities. Unfortunately, that story is still relevant, as are my grandfather's speeches to Congress in the 40s, my Uncle John Berry Jr.'s speeches to the Kentucky legislators in the 80s, and my father's writings that go back to the 60s. Actually, I think they go back before that, but anyway, okay, 50s and 60s. I hope that what I have written to read to you today in order to define the problems that the Berry Center is working on will be irrelevant by the time my grandchildren read it. To understand the problems of today's farmer and to be a part of the creation of a real local food system, we must all work to understand both ends of the problem. As people lose contact with the countryside and its people, more and more stereotyping is possible on both ends. There seems to be an idea in the minds of many good people who are concerned with agrarian issues that farmers are all entrepreneurial, or interested in organics, or interested in raising vegetables, and so on. Farmers are, in fact, all kinds of people, and for the most part, no more willing to take huge economic risks than anyone else. In our farm communities around Louisville, alternative crops are still a hard sell to farmers who have either tried themselves or had a neighbor who tried to sell vegetables and lost money at it, because there was no infrastructure to move or hold their product and no policy to protect them in the marketplace. I first heard the term agriculture in the middle from Fred Kirschenman in his fine book, Cultivating an Ecological Conscience. The term has been helpful to me in understanding the problems that are being encountered all over the country, and certainly in Kentucky, in getting farmers interested in raising vegetables and fruits. For years, it seemed to many of us that the problem was the market and that we must work hard to build a demand for local food. True enough, but now we see that the excitement that is going on in cities is not matched by what is going on in the countryside. Now we know that we must do the work of creating demand, supply, and infrastructure at the same time. And to the young people at St. Catherine, we also must create farmers. I have said, as many other people have, that what we are working on has to be more than a movement. To make the difference that will matter for our grandchildren, we must be working toward a cultural change. That is why Fred Kirschenman's phrase is clarifying to me. The world I grew up in was agriculture in the middle. Farming was our culture, our language. It was way beyond something we all had in common. We were country people, farm people, and it was all supported by the Burley Tobacco Program. The program gave us our economy. The farmers that I grew up around had highly diversified farms. Their incomes came from all kinds of products, but the tobacco crop was the dependable piece of their economic year. It meant that farmers could borrow money to buy a farm, as my husband and I did in 1981. As a couple of 22-year-olds, we were able to buy a farm based on our tobacco allotment. It allowed farmers to get operating money from local banks to get their crops out. Small towns in rural Kentucky were fairly robust because the businesses in town served a stable farm economy. The program also meant that all kinds of farmers, who were all kinds of people, would be protected from a boom and bust economy. For 75 years, farmers in Kentucky and other states in the Burley Belt were out of the three-way economic squeeze farmers have dictated to them. Now they are told what price they will be paid for what they produce. They are told what prices they will give for what they buy, and they are told how much freight they will pay to ship their products to market and their equipment from factories. Farmers are the only American business people who buy retail, sell wholesale, and pay the shipping both ways. For this work of creating a safe local food system to be lasting, it seems to me that agriculture in the middle is where we must focus. According to the 2002 agricultural census, in the 5 years between 1997 and 2002, the United States lost 14.5% of its mid-sized farms, those with gross sales between 50,000 and 500,000. During the same time period, the number of very small farms and the number of mega farms grew. Fred Kirschman says this about the predicament this puts eaters in. What emerges is a bipolar food system that offers consumers only two food choices: buying directly from small farmers through farmers markets, internet sales and other direct marketing arrangements, or buying mass-produced, usually highly processed, foods that arrive through supply chains dominated by mega food firms offering virtually no traceability or differentiated characteristics. None of this has been inevitable. This mess we are in is the result of decisions made, and I believe that on both the rural side and the urban side we have made incorrect, often lazy assumptions. And now we see that not only is there no urban or rural side, but the same side. We also see that a lot of our assumptions have been wrong. What if farmers, farm families, and farm communities are not expendable extras in the drama of industrial progress? What if they are indispensable to the health and long-term survival of our food supply? What if good farmers belong inalienably to the fertility of the land, and without them, the fertility will decline, as will productivity? What then? Remember that even though the farm population has been considered expendable, we have no evidence that this is true, and much evidence that it is not. And most of these farmers in our state are, using the economic information from the census, farmers in the middle. I think that there's much hope there. These farmers represent what is left of generational farming. Many of them know a lot about farming that is very hard to teach. Would that be true, Leah? And maybe, most importantly, they own the majority of Kentucky's 86,000 small farms. I said earlier that the problems we face today are cultural. We must become a people who deal with the whole problem, not pieces of the problem. This quotation from The Watches of the Night by Harry Caudle is helpful to me. I quote, "Many voices have decried mechanization, contending that when machines relegate men to idleness, their condition will be worse than before. There is a certain logic to this reasoning, but it is a logic hard to swallow when one watches a bucket excavator digging a ditch at a rate scores of men could not maintain. But what is the result when the machines sweep through an industry in a short time, replacing fathers, sons, and even grandsons, so that they simultaneously lose their livelihoods and all claim to status and standing? What happens to entire communities leveled by such traumas? What befalls the psyche and spirit of people so afflicted?" Unquote. Such questions have burdened the consciousnesses. I told Katie coming down here, if I don't quit putting in speeches words I can't pronounce. Consciences of no coal companies and of almost no politicians. A society dominantly industrial has no effective means either of democratizing the gains or of affecting the human costs of industrialization. The fate of workers is abandoned to the market in the labor market. This is exactly what has happened to our farming communities. It is the main reason I wanted to come to St. Catherine to start a farming program. I grew up in an ailing but still surviving agrarian community. When I came home from college to farm, I was surrounded by teachers who made themselves available to me every day, and I didn't even know it, which is the way community works for the young. That community is gone now, and the people I know who are trying to farm are doing it to a great extent alone. Here I found the rarest of institutions, a school that still has some local affections, a place where what is left of generational farm kids would be comfortable. My hope is that someday we will have at St. Catherine College an alternative land-grant college. I'm very happy to say that I see many bright spots on the horizon for the farmers that I have been talking about, and one is the progress being made by Louisville's Farm to Table program, especially their progress in institutional buying. The Jefferson County Public School System, the University of Louisville, some large food distributors, and some hospitals are either buying local food for the first time or, in JCPS's case, increasing what they are buying from last year and offering farmers contracts. The surface is just being scratched, but it is the beginning of moving enough food into Louisville that we can see just a glimpse of a way to replicate the economy tobacco gave Kentucky's farmers without them being dependent on a dangerous product. Pulling these farmers into production for local markets is complicated, to say the least, and a great deal of it is up to them, and that will be their part of the bargain. For instance, farmers must learn again to farm in ways that minimize their dependence on industrial supplies. They must produce on their farms as much fertility and energy as they can if they do not want to participate in their own destruction. Food consumers in the city need to be willing to think about where their food comes from and learn about those places. They must learn to see those places. One of the many things that worry me in the middle of the night is the fact that we have become a population of people who don't know what we're looking at. Urban people must push local leadership to work on issues of local food systems. If communities of farmers and consumers wish to promote a sustainable, safe, reasonably inexpensive supply of good food, then they must see that the best, the safest, and the most dependable source of food for a city is not the global economy, but its own surrounding countryside. It is in the best interest of people who live in cities to be surrounded by productive land, well-farmed and well-maintained by thriving farm families in thriving farm communities. Here are a few of the questions that I think we all, both urban and rural citizens, need to ask. Why do we need farmers? And once we figure that out, how can we work for policies that will protect them or give them parity in a free marketplace? How can we include local nature, the land, the water, the air, the native creatures within the membership of this community? How can local needs be supplied from local sources? How can we practice true accounting? For example, understanding the unsoundness of labor saving if it implies poor work, unemployment, or any kind of pollution or contamination, and account for costs now conventionally hidden or externalized. Whenever possible, these costs must be debited against actual income. How do we regain an economy that does not work to disregard community and ecological interests? A sustainable rural community will be dependent on urban consumers loyal to local products. We are then talking about an economy that will be more cooperative than competitive. I have been involved with farming all my life and have worked on small farm issues since I was a young adult. But the Berry Center would never have been started had I not been voted on or appointed to 3 agricultural boards at virtually the same time. They were the Farm Service Agency State Board, the Board of Directors of Community Farm Alliance, and the Mayor's Food Policy Council in Louisville, Kentucky. The first 2 groups don't have much in common other than the people who work for them work wholeheartedly on behalf of farmers. What they do have in common is a good deal of ignorance about farming. FSA is a huge USDA program. I was amazed to find out that they had not rejected our ideas about land use, local economies, etc. They had never heard them. On the other hand, the CFA board only knew that big ag is bad and were only interested in small entrepreneurial farms. The third group was the Mayor's Food Policy Council in Louisville, and for the first time, I saw the weakness in trying to solve this food system problem, focusing too much on the demand side and dealing with fantasy on the supply side. I found out that a lot of people who are on our side think that farmers are in the countryside just waiting for the chance to raise organic broccoli for large amounts of people for very little money. And so I went to my father with a list of things that need to be worked on: education, farm policy, access to capital, etc. He said, "It sounds like you're starting a center. Do it." I said, "To do this, I will have to speak for you to some degree." He said, "You and I speak with one voice. He's crazy." And anyway, here we are 2 or 3 years later, committed to bringing focus, knowledge, and cohesiveness to the work of changing our ruinous industrial agriculture system into a culture that uses nature as the standard, that accepts no permanent damage to the ecosphere, and takes into consideration human health in local communities. It is increasingly necessary that those of us still in rural places, and that is only 16% of us, insist that people keep their minds on the countryside. I want to say also that without Christy and Owsley Brown, there would be no Berry Center. I went to speak to them about another program in Louisville, and Christy said, "Well, what do you want to do?" Which she just doesn't let you sit around. And she and Owsley, that conversation made me feel like it was possible for me to do this. So I thank Christy every day. It is often tempting to think that we have gone too far, but I don't think the present bunch of living humans can be allowed to make the very restful claim, Christy, that there is nothing they can do, pleading the incorrigibility of their nature or their circumstances. And so I will end with an inventory of the resources we have at hand that will support us in our effort to do better. 1. First and fundamental are the examples of nature's own ways of land use in the native forests and grasslands that precede the human economy. These ways have been carefully studied by agricultural scientists from Albert Howard before the middle of the last century to Wes Jackson and his colleagues at the Land Institute in Kansas right now. One of our most urgent needs is for ecologists trained in the native forests and prairies to apply their knowledge in the economic landscapes. We humans, because of our limited intelligence, are never going to understand perfectly the nature of any place or fit our local economies perfectly into local ecosystems. But the right instructions or the right model for our use of a place can come only from the nature of that place. 2. We have from all over the world, from F.H. King's Farmers of 40 Centuries to the ongoing work right now of Vandana Shiva, examples of long-enduring traditional or peasant agricultures. These seem to have come from profoundly respectful observation of the nature of places, and they have embodied natural processes or analogs thereof. 3. We have Thomas Jefferson's great principle. If we understand that the state and the state's economy depend upon the land, and if we understand the numerousness, diversity, uniqueness, and vulnerability of the land's small places, and vulnerability of the land's small places, and so their dependence upon human care, we cannot doubt the truth of Jefferson's rule. 4. Scattered about the country and concentrated in some Amish communities, we have still surviving farmers and foresters who have held to established good practices and tried for better. It is not altogether a secret that in many a rural community you will find farmers or memories of farmers who have survived and even prospered in hard times by limiting their farms to a manageable size, by taking care of them, by avoiding or minimizing debt, by limiting or avoiding the purchase of new equipment, by subsisting so far as possible from their own land, and in general by saving rather than spending. 5. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, there has been a growing national and international movement toward local economies, starting with economies of local food. This is little noticed and poorly understood by the news media, mostly ignored in the state capitals and ignored completely in Washington. Washington, D.C., that is. Some city and county governments, however, have taken notice of this movement and understood its importance, as Greg Fisher has. I mentioned Louisville's Farm to Table program. Greg Fisher in Louisville has been an ardent supporter, as I think Mayor Gray, is that right, Christy, in Lexington has stepped forward. 6. We have by now a fairly long history of organic farming and gardening. We need to say, I think, that organic is as organic does. The term has often been too negatively defined. You simply don't use chemicals. And it can be too loosely defined. But it has always implied the standard of good health, and it seems by now to have escaped its old shadow of kookiness. 7. For a half dozen years now, we have had the 50-year Farm Bill, which addresses the specifically agricultural problems of soil erosion, toxicity, loss of diversity, and the destruction of rural communities. It proposes to invert the ratio of 80% annual to 20% perennial crops at present to 20% annual and 80% perennial in 50 years. This bill certainly comes from beyond the present margin of farm policy. And of course, the habitual objectors are happy to point out that there is now no chance of its passage, but such a bill could not have been written by people foolish enough to believe in its immediate passage. 8. The 50-year Farm Bill was published by the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, with the concurrence of other farm and conservation groups all over the country. That it came from the Land Institute should be no surprise, for that organization's great project for nearly 40 years has been the perennialization of agriculture, arriving finally at perennial grain fields of mixed species, in analogy to the native prairie. This project of perennial grain crops has now spread from Kansas to other states and other nations. The first of the necessary medley of perennial grains, a domesticated intermediate wheatgrass trademarked as Kernza, is already well developed and may be ready for distribution to farmers in 8 or 10 years. That in itself is a remarkable achievement, though much remains to be done. But I want to suggest that the kind of science practiced at the Land Institute is itself a great and necessary resource. It is, by definition, a local science carried on conscientiously in the context of the local prairie ecosystem and the local human community. Whatever is developed in that place will require local adaptation and the careful employment of many minds in other places. This science, moreover, is carried on with respect for local nature and local humanity. It is not going to produce a poison or an explosive. 9. Finally, and most necessarily, we have the ancient and long-enduring cultural imperative of neighborly love and work. This becomes ever more important as hardly imaginable suffering is imposed upon all creatures by industrial tools and industrial weapons. If we are to continue in our only world, with any hope of thriving in it, we will have to expect neighborly behavior of sciences, of industries, and of governments, just as we expect it of mere citizens in their neighborhoods, like what is going on right here, right now. To live, we must work. To work, we must work in a place. My place is Henry County in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I will work there. My father says that when he wrote The Unsettling of America, he had 4 allies, not counting his family. And now look, he says, there are good people working on these things everywhere. I will go to him when I get home and I'll tell him about the good people that I met here. He will say, and I join him in saying, God bless you. Thank you.